to share it with everybody because we often go through things and experience life, and we don't let other people know. And I think a lot of you are up against a lot of things that sometimes you just may take a deep breath and say, okay, what else is going to happen? Or take a deep breath and say, can I make it through this? Or you just may even think, I can't make it through this, okay? And we need to be praying for each other more. But we also need to be looking into the Scriptures and seeing how the Scriptures can help us. And today, as we continue talking about the life of Jonathan, we're going to look at something that is very similar to our lives. Remember, Jonathan, for the last couple of weeks, we talked about Jonathan and the armor bearer and that story, and about how he went out and I said expose. I'm about to say expose himself, but we can't say that in today's language. He went out and showed himself. Well, I don't know if we can say that either. But he and the armor bearer went and let the Philistine garrison see them. And he did it for a purpose. He did it to test whether or not it was God's will that God would deliver the Philistine army to the Israelite army, and in particular, that God would give Jonathan and his armor bearer a victory at that moment. So he went out there, he did that. You know the story. You know, they looked down and they said, hey, you two come on up here, we'll teach you a lesson. And Jonathan says, that's our cue. They took off up that cliff, crawling as fast as they could on hands and knees. They got to the top. They slayed the 20 so people in that garrison, and then the war all broke out. And we looked at that story. And it was a great story. And one of the things we said at the end of the story is that because of Jonathan being faithful to God, because of Jonathan putting his trust in the God, his influence was greatly increased. And we'll see a little bit more of that today. But one of the great things about that story is you have all these things happening. You have this victory. Man, I'm one of those people that I've got an imagination. So I just kind of imagined that you've got all this Israelite army people crawling out of the rocks, out of the bushes. They're joining in the fight. There's excitement. There's happiness. There's all these good things going on. And Jonathan he's leading it. And he's there. And he's joyful. And he's happy. But then, like us, boom, something happens. And it wasn't something he did. It wasn't something God did. It was something his father did. And it crushed the spirit. It crushed the moment. And we need to see how Jonathan responded to that. We need to see how Israel responded to that. Because hopefully in that, we can learn how to respond ourselves when we feel that way. Because it happens to us all the time, doesn't it? Maybe you're feeling good about a work project, and somebody else comes in and says, oh, that's stupid. Or, you got this all wrong. Or, why'd you do this? Or, why'd you do that? And I see several of you smiling because you know that's happened to you. I see some of you going, because I know that's happened to you too, okay? Maybe you're having a good time and a friend stabs you in the back. Or a family member says something really hurtful to you. Or does something. Those things happen. So how do we respond to those problems? How do we respond to those things? What is it we should be looking for? It's a little bit different than what I was thinking this week as I was preparing the message, but it fits in so well. So we're going to talk about the life of Jonathan today, and we're going to talk about the concept of loyalty. Because it's loyalty to God. It is loyalty to Nancy that helps me get through things with us. Those two things. It's loyalty to each other that can help us live through life. So it's 1 Samuel chapter 14. We're going to go verses 24 through 26. We're going to read all, I think there's a couple of verses I skipped, but we're going to read most of those verses, and some of them we're just going to read through just so we can understand the story, okay? If you have YouVersion Bible app, you can scan the QR code, go there, or you can open your app, go to events, find, Jim Glory English Ministry, and the sermon notes will be there as well. Okay? So, it says on there, it says loyalty. Okay? I sometimes like to start with definitions. I think I know what loyalty is, but not, I may not be the smartest person in the room, so I got to look things up all the time. But I like the secondary definition here. It says a strong feeling or support or allegiance. I am loyal to Nancy. Nancy always doesn't feel that, but I am loyal to Nancy. And part of my job is to help Nancy to feel that, to know, for her to, when she leaves every morning, to know that I support her, that I'm allegiant to her. I'm not going to fail her. I'm not going to, I may fail her because, I'm me. But I'm not going to forsake her. I'm always going to try because she is that important to me. That's what loyalty does. Okay? So we're going to look at loyalty. Now, last 2 weeks, I'm going to go quickly over the last 2 weeks because I'm one of those people. I think we need to see the whole picture, and we need to understand all of Jonathan's life and how every bit of Jonathan's life affects the next bit of his life. Okay? So Jonathan's faith in God and integrity and leadership called him to action. Remember, he took his army of 1,000 that Saul gave him and went and attacked Geba, the first garrison, and the outpost there. They won the victory. And Jonathan was just one of those type of people that he said, hey, if I'm going to trust God, and I'm going to do what God wants to do, and I'm going to believe that God can handle this, and so I'm going to go forward and I'm going to take action, okay? Second thing is that we learned is with Jonathan's faith in God is evident as he believed anything was possible, okay? Going back to that story, you remember the Philistine army had at least 6,000 chariots. They had about 3,000 men in their whole army together. He said that the Israelites were so afraid because they looked out and they saw that the infantry, the soldiers, were as numerous as sands on the seashore. And they hid in the rocks. They hid in the bushes. But Jonathan was believing in faith that God was going to deliver the Philistines into their hands. He didn't hide. He went out and sought the battle because he knew that God would give them the victory. I bet you Jonathan understood he couldn't do it himself. You think Jonathan thought, oh, I'm going to take my armor bearer and I'm going to defeat an army of at least 30,000 people? No, he didn't think that. He thought, I'm going to take the armor bearer and I'm going to let God use me and I'm going to see how God's going to defeat this army. That's his trust. He believed anything was possible. And then 2 weeks ago, the last thing we said was we said we need leaders that model and exemplify faith and trust in God. We need leaders who are willing to sacrifice and say, I believe this is what God wants us to do, so we're going to do it. We need leaders who are willing to say, no more time in talking about it, it is time to act. Those type of leaders. And this type of leader Jonathan was. And then last week, we looked specifically at his leadership skills, and we said, hey, there are some things we can learn. And one of the things that we learned from him was that we need to clearly communicate our plans, okay? And when we clearly communicate our plans, Jonathan had kind of a way he went about it. One of the things he did was he repeated things. He had clear reputation. There was 2 or 3 instances where he said to his armor bearer, come on, let's go show ourselves to the Philistine army and see what God will do. And he repeated that again and again. And then when it came time, when they got down into the valley and they were looking up at the cliffs and they were about ready for the Philistines to see him, he gave a clear explanation what would happen. Hey, armor bearer, here's what's going to happen, okay? If we're down here and they say, hey, wait there, we're going to come down to you, that's one thing. But if they say, hey, come up here and fight us, then we know that God has given them into our hands. And we're going to take action. Very, very clear. The other thing he did on that was he clearly communicated the plan, was he let the armor bearer know it wasn't him that was just going to go up that cliff. He said, we're going to go. God will give us the victory together. So he included him on everything. And then the next thing we see about his leadership is he was a take action type of guy, okay? Yeah, he would investigate, he would look, he would find his facts, but he was ready to take action when it was taking action. He would go and do it. When they said, hey, come up here, you guys, he didn't hesitate. He just looked at the armor bearer and said, hey, let's go. God's delivered them into our hands. And boom, they went as fast as they could. He took action. And then the other thing that we notice about the story is that the armor bearer was not in front. He was not leading. That's where the armor bearer should have been. But Solomon, it's not Solomon. This is, who's this guy? Jonathan. Jonathan was leading from the front. He was leading the attack. In some ways, he was protecting the armor bearer a little bit. And I didn't mention that before, but I thought about that. If the armor bearer was behind him fighting, the armor bearer was being protected a little bit by Jonathan. The armor bearer was free to fight. He was free to pick up a sword, to pick up a spear, to pick up a rock, whatever else it was needed to fight. And Jonathan saw that the teamwork was so important, and that through teamwork we get much more done than we do if we are individuals. And then this part of it, and I love this part of it. Remember at the end of the story, or toward the end of the story, as they were attacking the garrison, as they wiped out the garrison, the reports got back to the Philistine army. It says that God caused a panic among them. See, when you're in sync with God's will, and you're doing what God wants you to do, good things are going to happen. And God will work. God will do things that you won't even imagine. You can't even think about. You can't even dream about the possibilities of what God can do. So when you're in sync with God, good things happen. And then we talked about Erwin McManus in the book he wrote, Seizing Your Divine Moment. And we talked about how this was Jonathan's divine moment, and he seized it. And that's what leaders do. They see the opportunity, and they seize that opportunity. It can be scary. It can be risky. But if you're seeking out God, God will show you his way. He'll guide you, advise you, and watch over you. And you can do it. So that brings us to where we are in our story right now. So it says, the men of Israel were hard-pressed that day, for Saul had made the army agree with this oath. Cursed be the man who eats food before evening. Now, there are a couple things happening here. First of all, in the storyline, this probably should have happened a little bit earlier if we're following the storyline chronological. Because when David I get my names all mixed up today, okay? I'll probably call him Jeremiah here before long. Some of you were here last week, got that joke. All right. When Jonathan and the armor bearer attacked, and they attacked that garrison, and the panic happened, the war happened right then, okay? The Israelites were coming out of the cracks. The other tribes, one other tribe of Israel, the men joined in, attacking from the other side. It wasn't like things happened and they had a little meeting, a conference, and said, well, okay, this is going on. And then Saul said, well, don't eat anything, okay? This oath that probably Saul did probably was happening when Jonathan and the armor bearer were down in that valley, about ready to go up that cliff. It probably happened at that same time, because what we find out later is that Jonathan didn't know anything about this oath, okay? So Saul was gathered with the army. We know that immediately when the commotion started happening and things started battling, Saul was asking, where's Jonathan? And everybody's like, well, he's not here. And it's like, oh, okay. But so Saul came to them and he said, hey, here's the oath, okay? I don't want you to eat anything all day long. Now imagine, you're a soldier. You're in Saul's army. Saul gives you a commandment not to eat anything. But here you are fighting. And you're not just standing there fighting, you're chasing down Philistines. You're running. You're running up hills, down hills, around hills, through streams, over rocks. You're expending lots and lots and lots of energy. And you're excited because, here was this army that you thought was invincible. They're falling before you. You see God at work. You see Jonathan's leadership. You see Jonathan's faith in God, and things are exciting, but yet you can't eat. What's going to happen? You're going to be exhausted. Other English translations of that, hard pressed, one of them says exhausted, uses the word exhausted, okay? Another one uses, I don't remember what used, but they were extremely weary, extremely weak. They were pressed, again, as it says there, okay? And this is what happened. And Saul was rash. Why did Saul make this oath? It's a good question. Why did he make this oath? Because as we look at this, it doesn't make any sense. Why would he say, let's not eat? If you go back to part of the story we didn't talk about, what happened when Saul was waiting for Samuel to do the blessing before they went into war? Remember, Saul got impatient. Saul didn't wait for Samuel. Saul went and made the offerings himself, which was against the rules, the spiritual laws that they had governing them at the time. Saul took it upon himself to do what God had ordained somebody else to do. And so Saul sinned. And Saul knew when Saul was offering those sacrifices, he knew it. And as soon as Samuel came, as soon as he got done, Samuel showed up. And Samuel said, what have you done? And Saul started giving excuses. And I know from my life, when I sin and someone questions me about it and I start giving excuses, that's when I know I'm guilty. Okay? Now, if they question me about something and I don't give excuses, then I start wondering, well, but if I start making excuses, well, is this. That's what Saul did. Saul made excuses. Well, my army was hiding. People were leaving. They were deserting me. If I didn't do something, everybody would be gone. I'd be all by myself. Well, Jonathan would have been there. And the armor bearer. But Jonathan, the armor bearer, still would have said, well, it's just the three of us. God can deliver. Let's go. Okay? But Saul started making excuses. And because of that, God was angry at Saul. God was angry at Saul because Saul was not loyal to God in trusting God and God's provision. So, we come to this point. And Saul has heard from Samuel that the kingdom will be taken out of his family's hands, that his family line will not be kings throughout Israel, that God will look for someone else to be king. He is sorry. I think he's sorry that he did it. But again, Saul hasn't learned a lesson. He's trying to do something on his own to get God's favor. Okay? God, I'm going to fast today so that you will give me this. And God says, that's not what fasting is for. Fasting is not to win me over. Both my boys do this, and Joshua's right here, but his little brother does it a little bit better. Especially, he works really well on his popo, and it works really well on my mom too, and it works well on other people. He'll turn his head a little bit, tilt it down, and he'll look up like this at you. Kind of those puppy dog eyes type of thing. Please. Okay. They have their little techniques. Dad, you're such a great dad. Uh-huh. So you're going to let me eat. Uh-huh. Okay. This is what Saul was doing. He was trying on his own to somehow win the favor of God back. And in that, he was thinking about himself. He'd already been disloyal to God. Now he's being disloyal to Israelite, to his people, because he's not putting their needs ahead of his needs. He's putting his needs. And so he's showing them disloyalty. So he comes and he makes this oath. And this is the first lesson today that we should consider and we should think about. Carefully consider the oaths or promises you make to God and others. Consider the effect. Okay? That army was famished. That army was exhausted. They were tired. And then the second thing about this is Scripture teaches is better choice is to avoid oaths altogether. That's the better choice. Look at these verses. But I say to you, do not take oath at all. In Matthew, Jesus speaking, let your word be yes, or let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. More than this is from the evil one. And basically what Jesus is saying, hey, if you live your life with integrity, if you live your life loyal to God, then what you say is already an oath. Your yes is yes, your no is no. Nobody has to question that. You don't need to swear on anything. You don't need to make an oath on anything. You don't need to do all these things. And so oaths are not necessary. So avoid them. It's best to avoid them. Look at what this verses say in Ecclesiastes, okay? And it's a long passage, but let me read it to you. It says, when you make a promise to God, don't delay in following through. Why? For God takes no pleasure in fools. Okay? God, if you do this for me, then I will do this for you. God does it, and you don't do it. God just, I don't know if God says ayo, but okay. Keep all the promises you make to him. It is better to say nothing than to make a promise and not keep it. And I should learn this, especially with the boys. Last weekend, I promised them we could go play basketball, but then it was too hot, and then something else, I think it rained then, wasn't it? And then something else happened, and we didn't get to go play basketball that day, but we went the next day finally to go play basketball. And same thing today. There's too much homework, there's too much this, there's too much that. So it's better for me not to say, I promise you tomorrow I will take you to go play basketball. It's better for me to say, we will try as much as we can to go play basketball. Understand? So he says, don't make promises. It's better to say nothing. And sometimes it's just better to say nothing. It's better for me just to say, hey, you guys want to go play basketball right now? Okay? That type of thing. So, don't let your mouth make you sin. And don't defend yourself by telling the temple messenger that the promise you made was a mistake. Oh, well, I didn't really mean that. No, we don't do that, okay? That would make God angry, and he might wipe out everything you have achieved. Why does it make God angry? Because he wants your yes to be yes and your no to be no. Talk is cheap. And I like the way it says this, like daydreams and other useless activities. Fear God instead. Speak the truth. That's your oath. Without making it. You just speak the truth. All right. So let's go back to the verse 24. In the second part of verse 24, we read it first part, all right. Cursed be the man who eats food before evening. I will get my vengeance on my enemies. Okay, so here we see Saul's, what I just explained to you, is his reasoning for it. He's looking for his vengeance. He's not looking to honor God. He's not looking for God's victory, okay? He's talking about his own self. I want to make myself look good. I want people to sing about me. Well, you know, later that with David, you know, he was upset because the song was Saul's killed his thousands, if David had killed his 10,000s. He was all looking for glory for himself. He was not looking for glory for God. He was not putting the kingdom of God first. He was not putting the kingdom of Israel first. Again, where was his loyalty? His loyalty was not toward God. It was not toward the people of Israel. It was to himself. And he says, so no one in the army ate anything. Now, this shows you their respect for their king, because it frustrated them. It probably made them angry. It probably made them sad, especially when we're going to read these next few verses a little bit after this. But before we get there, I want you to contrast Saul's attitude with Jonathan's attitude. Remember back in Jonathan 14:6, what did he say? Perhaps the Lord will intervene for us. Nothing can prevent the Lord from delivering, whether by many or by few. Jonathan says, let's go into battle because God wants us to go into battle. Not for vengeance, not for glory, not for honor, not for all those other things. Look at the next verse. The Lord has given him into our hands. It will be assigned to us. Look at the next verse. The Lord has given him into the hands of Israel. You see a difference in attitude there? Jonathan's focused on God. Saul's focused on himself. That simple, that easy. So that's our next point. Keep your focus on God, not your own agenda, your needs, or your own wants. Okay? Now, it's okay for us to address our own needs, our own agenda, and our own wants. But those should not be the priority. As a husband, as a father, as a follower of God, God's needs, wants, agenda should be my top priority. My second priority should be Nancy's wants, needs. My third priority should be my boys' wants and needs and agenda. The fourth priority should be my extended family, both sides, both Nancy's and mine as well. Okay? And you guys are included in that because I consider you family. Okay? So there. Okay? All right. But that's how we should be looking at things, and that's where our loyalty should be. My needs, my agenda, my wants are down here. Everybody else is above. That's the way it should be. All right, look at the next couple of verses. It says, now the whole army entered the forest, and there was honey on the ground. You ever been really, really thirsty? I remember a few years ago, when we used to, some of you were around, we used to do the beach cleanups. We stopped doing it during COVID, but we did beach cleanups. And I remember one day at the end of the beach cleanup, there was a couple of us, we were exhausted. And there was a little place there, and I went and got a Coke with lots of ice in it. So it was very, very cold because it was very, very hot that day. And I took a drink of it, and I went, thank you, Jesus, for Coca-Cola. I don't think I said that, but I should have. There was another part of our team, and he was busy managing things. And I said, can I get you anything? And he's just like, man, he says, I'm just exhausted. So I went and got him a cold Coke. Same thing. And I handed it to him. I said, here, you need to drink something. This is cold. Drink this. And I said, we've been working hard all day. The Coke will give you some electrolytes, some sugars, stuff like that. It's good for you. Okay? There are times when Coke is good for you. So I gave it to him. You know what he said to me later? He said, that was the best thing for me at that time. Imagine being the Israelite army. You're fighting, you're chasing the Philistines, you're tired, you come into this forest, and there's so much honey, it's just oozing out on the ground everywhere. Okay? You see the bees, yeah, you see, but and you're looking at that honey and you're thinking, oh, honey tastes so sweet. Honey's so good, and yeah, I don't have a piece of bread to dip it into the honey, but man, I would really like a taste of that honey. Imagine chasing the Philistines' army, and as you're chasing the Philistine army, because they're in a panic that was set by God, they're not taking anything with them. They're leaving their sheep, their cattle, their grain, their everything else. And can you imagine running through the camps or running along the road where they have, dropped that off the side, and you're so hungry and you're looking at it going, I can't have any because Saul made an oath. And I'm afraid if I break that oath, what will happen to me? Because oaths are serious things. Because even if the oath doesn't come from God, God still expects us to follow that oath. And in this situation, the oath was punishable by death. And they're looking at that. Okay? They entered the forest. They saw the honey flowing, but no one ate any of it, for the army was afraid of the oath. And then next verse. But Jonathan had not heard about the oath, probably because that was when he was down in that valley looking up at that garrison. He had not heard about the oath his father had made the army take, so he extended his staff. Jonathan looked at it and said, man, look what God's provided. Because he's always focused on God. God's provided all this honey, and he takes his staff, he dips it in there. He brings his staff back, and he goes, like having a lollipop. An ice cream cone. And he says, wow, that was really good. He dipped it into the honeycomb, and when he ate it, his eyes gleamed. Just like that man I gave that Coke that day. His strength was restored. This is what happened to Jonathan. Verse 28. Then someone from the army informed him, Jonathan, I don't know how to tell you this, but your father put the army under an oath, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats the food today, or eats food today." That is why the army is tired. Now, I like that he added that little statement. Oh, by the way, Jonathan, I'm informing you the army is exhausted. They're tired. They're worn down, everything else. And it's all because we can't eat. Now, he was doing two things. He wasn't condemning Jonathan. He wasn't saying, "Oh, Jonathan, you're bad. I'm going to go tell on you," and everything else. But I think this man respected Jonathan a lot. He liked him. He would follow him anywhere. And he heard about the oath, and he was afraid for Jonathan. And so he's telling Jonathan. But he's also telling Jonathan the problems of the oath. Then Jonathan said, "My father has caused trouble for the whole land." Do you see what just happened? Saul has lost God's favor. He lost Samuel's favor. He's lost the people's favor because of this oath. And now he's lost his son. "My father has caused trouble for the land. See how my eyes gleamed when I tasted a little bit of this honey." Certainly the army had eaten some of the enemy's provisions they came across today. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? He's looking at this and he's like, this is a problem. So here's our next thing, okay? How does Jonathan approach problems? Now this is a little side thing. First thing he did this was he considered the problem. He said the army is tired. That is the main problem. Why is the army tired? He located the source. The source of it is because of Saul's oath, because Saul didn't allow them to eat, and yet there was plenty of food. There was honey on the ground. There was provisions from the other army. So that was the source of the problem. And then he said this, let's identify a solution. What was the solution? If only the army had eaten. That was it wasn't a difficult solution. It was a simple solution. And then he says this. I like that last phrase because he says we got a problem. Here's the cause. Here's the solution. And basically what he's saying is we enact the solution. Here's what could have happened. We could have had a far greater victory. Okay? And sometimes when we make oaths, sometimes when we quickly go into things, what happens is we don't experience the full will, provision, blessing that God has in store for us. Does that make any sense? Okay? And that's what happened in this situation. That oath caused them. That day, they could have wiped out the whole Philistine army and never had to deal with them again. But we know they're going to have to deal with them, because that guy Goliath comes along later. We know they're going to be a constant thorn in their side. But if they had a great victory that day, maybe those things wouldn't have happened. So, approaching a problem, consider the problem, locate the source, identify the solution, foresee the positive outcome. That's just a little outtake of what we can learn from Jonathan and how Jonathan goes from things. Let's continue on with the story. That day, the army struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon and became very tired in 1 Samuel 14:31. 14:32. So the army rushed greatly onto the plunder, confiscating sheep, cattle, and calves, and they slaughtered them right on the ground, and the army ate the blood and all. Now, this is a little bit strange. They had made an oath. Saul made an oath. They didn't eat all day long. Okay? Because they didn't eat all day long, they grew weary, they grew tired. They stopped chasing the Philistines. And what happened then? Then they started sinning against the Lord. If there's one thing, if you look to the Old Testament law, one thing that stands out above everything is what? Don't eat or drink the blood of an animal or a person, any living thing, because the blood represents the life force of that living thing. And God was very specific about that. But yet here they are. They're so hungry. Yeah, I mean, they slaughter a lamb, they rip off the leg, they just start eating it raw. Sinning against God. Verse 33, it was reported to Saul, look at the army sinning against the Lord by eating the blood. And he said, all of you have broken the covenant. Roll a large stone over here to me. And then if you read the next couple of verses, I did put the next verse in there. Then Saul said, scatter among the army and say to them, each one of you bring me your ox and your sheep and slaughter them in the spot and eat. But don't sin against the Lord by eating the blood. So that night each one brought his ox and slaughtered it there. Now, Saul did do a good thing here. Saul did say, we got a problem. How are we going to solve this problem? So they set up a place to slaughter the animals where they could drain the blood and then they could go eat it. He brought some order back to the chaos that was happening because of their anger. But if you notice too, he blames them for the sin. Okay? He didn't realize it was his oath that caused them to be to that point. If they had ate, if they weren't famished, they probably wouldn't have been doing this. So he goes on in verse 36. It says, after all that was done, after they did their sacrifices, and he said that they ate that night. So we kind of presume this is maybe the next morning or the next day. He says, let's go down to the Philistines at night, and we will rout them till the break of day. We won't leave any of them alive. And they replied, do whatever seems best to you. But the priest said, let's approach God first. Okay? So his spiritual advisor is saying, hey, we think this is good. The army thinks it's good. They've ate now. They're ready to go. We've seen what God's been doing, but let's just make sure this is what God wants for us. So Saul asked God, should I go down after the Philistines? Will they deliver them into the hand of Israel? But God did not answer him that day. He sat around all day long waiting for God to answer. Didn't know what God was going to say. Then Saul said, all you leaders of the army, come here. Find out how this sin occurred today. So Saul's judgment was that God didn't answer because there was sin in the camp. For surely as the Lord delivers Israel's lives, even if it turns out to be my own son Jonathan, he will certainly die. But no one from the army said anything. I think Saul was probably the only person that did not know that Jonathan ate honey. Jonathan and the armor bearer may have been the only people that didn't know about the oaths. Saul was the only one that didn't know that Jonathan had honey. Didn't know what Jonathan said because I'm sure that went out through that camp. Those soldiers like, Jonathan said his dad was wrong, that type of thing. And here Saul is. Did you see what he just did? Unofficially, he made another oath. Surely that person will die. Wow. Again, being rash. Again, not thinking about everybody else, but thinking about himself. He assumed it was the sin of somebody else, not his own sin. So he told his son Jonathan, tell me what you have done. And Jonathan replies to him and says, I used the end of the staff that was in my hand to taste a little bit of honey. Now, I have to say this. If I was Jonathan and I didn't know about that oath, I probably would have had a lot of honey. But he was just saying it was insignificant. It didn't mean much. And then he says, I must die. Now, he's not saying, you're right, I did this, I should die. But the better way to put this is, should I die over this? Okay? And he was asking a question. Because again, Jonathan, I think, he lost respect for his father because of the oath. He lost respect because of his father because of all this. He was frustrated with his dad. He was frustrated because he saw what God could have done, and he saw how what had happened had hampered all that. And he was just like, this is such a little thing. Why should I die over this? Then God says to him, well, God will punish me severely even if Jonathan doesn't die. Do you remember Jonathan's problem solving? Identify the problem. What caused it? What's the solution? And then what's the future? Saul doesn't, he identifies a problem, his sin. But he doesn't really check out the cause. He assumes the cause is because somebody else sins. But all this happened because of his sin in making the oath. Jonathan, in some ways, was completely innocent here because Jonathan didn't hear the oath, so he wasn't bound by the oath when he ate. And Saul could have looked at the problem and said, well, here's the problem is I made the oath, Jonathan ate, here's a possible solution. He didn't know about the oath, so he wasn't bound by the oath at the time, so I can just set him free. But he said, no, you must die. Saul's misguided zeal is also seen in his seeking to justify himself before God while condemning his innocent son. A believer filled with strong and fearless faith. Saul still wasn't taking responsibility. Over and over again, and every time it just causes more problems. Look at this. We said earlier we need to carefully consider the promises we make to God and others. Okay? And here's the results of that oath he made. The army was exhausted. Total victory was not won. They could have wiped out the Philistines, and it didn't happen. Both the army and Jonathan were frustrated with him, with his leadership, with the things that he did. And Jonathan was then condemned to die. And then we got a couple more things that we're going to see. And that Saul loses all credibility. And we've kind of addressed this already, but he loses all credibility in his next couple of verses. It is just plain as day. And then the war ends prematurely because of this rash oath. Look at the next verse. But the army said to Saul, should Jonathan, who won this great victory in Israel, die, may it never be. As surely as the Lord lives, not a single hair on his head will fall to the ground, for it is with the help of God that he has acted today. So the army rescued Jonathan from death. The army sees Saul, impatient, doesn't wait for God's timing, doesn't wait for Samuel. Impatient and rash and foolish by making this oath. And then responds again with more rashness, more foolishness by wanting to condemn his son to death. And then the army contrasts that with Jonathan. And they say Jonathan, the man who trusts God, who points us to God, who leads us to have faith in God, that God will deliver us. And not only does Jonathan lead us to do that, not only does Jonathan say that, but we've seen it happen through Jonathan. They didn't give the credit to Jonathan. They gave the credit to God working through Jonathan. So the army rebelled against Saul and said, no, this will not happen. We're not going to put him to death. And so they rescued Jonathan at that point. And so we have pictures of loyalty throughout this chapter, chapter 13 and 14. And that loyalty makes a big difference in Jonathan's life. Saul shows no loyalty to God or the people via his actions, his attitudes, his vows, his oath, whatever you want to say there. Okay? Jonathan displays his loyalty to God, then to the people, through his trust in God. Through his leadership by following God and inviting others to come join in. And by seizing that divine moment to see when God's ready to act and jumping in and being part of that. See, there was a man named Henry Blackaby, and Henry Blackaby used to talk about the will of God, and he said one of the things about the will of God is you look around and you see where God is working, then you jump into that. And that's what Jonathan did when he seized that divine moment. And that was all because of his loyalty. The people, their loyalty wavered a little bit. Their loyalty wavered when they were famished because they were disloyal to God. They didn't follow the commands. But because of Jonathan's leadership, they turned things back around and became loyal to God. And they were definitely loyal to Jonathan. because of what they saw in his life. So if you want people to be loyal to you, you be loyal to God. If you want people to follow you, you follow God. If you want people to respect you and to listen to you, respect and listen to God and go that way. Last thing here. It says, consider carefully the promises God has given you. Keep your focus on God, not your own agenda. And be loyal to God and to each other. That's the three main takeaways today. Loyalty to God and to each other will get you many places. Last verse. Then Saul stopped chasing the Philistines. And the Philistines went back home. See, when Saul lost his army, he lost their loyalty, he lost their allegiance. I think Saul finally recognized it wasn't something he could do. So he went back home. And probably when he went back home, we know that in the next couple of chapters, and we're going to see some of it, we're going to skip some of it, but we know that Saul had tantrums, basically. He had fits, what they called it. Basically, I think what he did was he got super depressed. And one of the things that David enters the picture because they bring David in because he was a harp player. So comforting, so peaceful to Saul, it calmed him down. And so Saul struggled. But then we see Jonathan, and we see the results in the long run of Jonathan, and we see that Jonathan just doesn't fade away at this point. But Jonathan remains an important part of Israel and who Israel is. Jonathan becomes a master archer. He leads men into battles. He becomes a friend of David. He's loyal to God to the very end. And that loyalty to God makes him loyal to Israel and loyal to his friends. So, are you a Saul? Or are you a Jonathan? Do you have integrity in how you live your life for God? Do you have loyalty to God? Are you loyal to God and others as well? Jesus, in talking about himself, says this in John 4:34. He said, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." God has placed each of us here for a purpose. He has a work that he wants you to do. Be loyal to God. Find his will. Do his work. Finish that work he has asked you to do. Let's go to God in prayer.